Right now, though, we're going to talk about something that went down last night at the Bell Center. One of the most hyped UFC events in a long time, especially for the Canadian audience. And our next guest was there live in person. He talked about it prior to the event on Friday night. He'll talk about it again this coming Wednesday night for Ringside Report Radio. RingsideReport.net is the website. You can follow him on Twitter.com/Dave Simon MMA. It is Dave Simon. What's up, Dave?
You were talking about NC2A, of course, the March Madness coming up, but it was a two-time Division I National Wrestling Champion Johnny Hendricks in action last night.
Nice tie-in.
How about that? And that's an NC2A Division I tournament that I think far more respectable and should get far more attention, the National Wrestling Tournament. Johnny Hendricks, 4 years at Oklahoma State, two-time national champion, one-time runner-up, and the other time he finished in the top 8. So a four-time All-American, a two-time national champion. This guy has got serious credentials, and he is ready and willing to fight George St. Pierre, and that is next for him.
He has a beard that reminds me of Marco Polo.
Yeah, you know what? I was actually speaking to Marco Polo earlier today, and he told me he watched the fight, and he liked the guy with the beard. And I said, yeah, obviously, he looks like you, except maybe a little bit in better shape.
Could be. Could be. Now, Dave, does it surprise you to find out that I, Matthew Ross, having never seen a full UFC card, I actually watched the full press conference of St. Pierre, Diaz. They didn't even have any questions really for the other guys. One, I think, for Hendricks. Was this a mainstream fight, so to speak? Was there a lot of... Are you hearing more of people like me, perhaps, that tuned in more so than normal?
When my girlfriend's mom is talking to me about Nick Diaz and she doesn't like his attitude, you know it's hit the mainstream.
I almost did a spit take there. That was hard. That was hard to hold in. That's pretty interesting.
Everybody's talking about it. Everybody, if you're in this city, you were watching the fight last night, or you were paying attention, or you knew somebody that was watching the fight.
You needed to know what happened.
Yeah, everybody in the city was paying attention because George St. Pierre is, I think, the greatest champion that Canada has ever seen, the greatest athlete that this country has ever seen, and he was victorious once again last night. Another brilliant performance. This guy is unbelievable. He really is in a class all of his own. He was able to out-wrestle and out-fight Nick Diaz for 5 rounds, stood up with Nick Diaz, landed some punches. Maybe Nick got the better of the exchanges on the feet. There was an instance where Nick was landing a few in a row, but definitely on the ground, it was all George St. Pierre. And, a lot of people like to criticize George St. Pierre about taking his opponents down and just kind of keeping them down. And you can't help but be impressed with what he did last night. It was a typical GSP performance where he out-wrestles his opponents and he wins a 5-round decision, but just the way that he does it, and I train and I do jiu-jitsu and stuff, and just watching him, it's ridiculous to see the technique and the skill that this man possesses. It's on another level. He is a legit black belt in jiu-jitsu, and he was able to really ground Nick Diaz. A lot of the techniques he was using, I was really, really impressed with. Nick Diaz is a super tough guy to keep on his back, to keep on the ground, and he's also a very tough guy to avoid submissions from. I mean, Nick Diaz is a black belt as well. Under Cesar Gracie, he is legit, and George St. Pierre was able to avoid all the submissions from Nick Diaz. He has an amazing ground game. His hip
Does he look better than before
control,
his injury, even? Or just as good? Or?
I think last night was the best George St. Pierre we've ever seen. The guy's hip control is out of this world. He can keep his opponent down like no other, and he really is the best wrestler in mixed martial arts. I don't think we've ever seen a better George St. Pierre than we saw last night. I think Johnny Hendricks is going to be an interesting challenge for him. He possesses those big, heavy hands. And
wrestler versus wrestler.
Yeah, definitely. Wrestler versus wrestler. And a lot of people will say, well, Johnny Hendricks, he's got the wrestling skill and the pedigree to have to avoid the takedown from George St. Pierre. Wrestling in college when you're just a wrestler and wrestling in MMA are two different things. Wrestling in MMA, there's striking that you have to worry about. So you're not always defending the takedown. When you're wrestling, you know what's coming. The guy's going to try and take you down. When you're fighting, you don't know if the guy's going to try and kick you in the head or take you down. So you can keep your hands low in kind of a wrestler stance, but if you do that, you'll get kicked in the face and you'll get knocked out. So Johnny Hendricks has to be very careful with George St. Pierre. No one mixes up the striking and the wrestling like George St. Pierre. And I think, as good as Johnny Hendricks is, that GSP will beat him. I think the GSP we saw last night is the best GSP we've ever seen, and I tweeted it late last night that I think the George St. Pierre that we saw can beat Anderson Silva. And I never thought GSP could beat Anderson, but the guy we saw last night can take Anderson Silva down at will and can control him. If he can do what he did last night to Nick Diaz, I believe he can do it to Anderson Silva as well. And if he can get past Johnny Hendricks, I think that fight will be around the corner.
Chatting with Dave Simon of Ringside Report Radio about last night's UFC 158. Of course, this province's own George St. Pierre victorious over Nick Diaz in a much hyped event. Dana White, I'm sure, breathing a nice sigh of relief, seeing GSP once again prevailing and looking dominant to the point that people will want to see if he can keep it up in his next fight. Dave, back to St. Pierre for a second. It seems to be there's a growing not outrage or anything like that, but support for an anti-GSP movement because some people find him not good for the sport, is what I hear. I watched an interview with Ronda Rousey, one of their big new, obviously, attractions now that they have women's MMA, and she was rooting for Nick Diaz openly, saying that George St. Pierre is bad for the sport because he sits on the ground and he just goes round for round, waiting for the unanimous decision instead of going for the kill. Where do you weigh in on that?
I'm with Ronda.
Really?
On that, yeah. I think George St. Pierre is an amazing wrestler. He's got such great technique. But a takedown and holding your opponent down does very little to finish a fight. He hasn't been finishing fights. And his style, albeit impressive, is not really conducive to an end of a fight. He doesn't really go for submissions. He was defending submissions. I don't think he had one submission attempt last night. And the strikes that he scores on the ground aren't particularly significant. He controls the fight. He controls where it takes place, but he doesn't do a lot of damage. And I agree with Nick Diaz. I agree with Ronda Rousey, and this is not a popular opinion here, especially in Montreal, but I'm an MMA fan, and I like to see mixed martial arts, and I like to see fighters go in to finish a fight, not to win. And, Nick Diaz has talked about how pride rules were better and you couldn't elbow guys on the ground. And that's, George St. Pierre's biggest weapon. And that really is, I think, what he looks to, if anything, to finish a fight on the ground. It's going to be his big elbow, but he just doesn't land it a lot. He lands those little shots. And I wouldn't mind going back to a pride rules type of scenario where there aren't any elbows on the ground. You have to create the space to throw a punch because, as Nick Diaz says, that same distance that you need to throw a punch is that same distance that Nick Diaz needs to get back to his feet. I like that style. I think that pride-style fighting, Japanese rules of MMA when they have the dream cards, I think it's more exciting. And I think that North American mixed martial arts has deviated from where the sport should be. I don't know if it's ever going to change. I think it's going to take a lot to change the rules at this point. But I love George St. Pierre for what he's able to do.
But it's not your favorite style, is basically what you're saying.
It's not my favorite style of fighting. I would rather watch a guy like Nick Diaz who goes for the finish than a guy like GSP who goes for the win. And there are a lot of guys now in MMA that are fighting for points, fighting for the win, and fighting to avoid damage. I like guys that go in and finish. I like guys like Anderson Silva and John Jones who are going in, fighting the top
offensive style,
top class, and they go in and they finish their fights. I like George St. Pierre too. I mean, he's amazing. He's an amazing athlete. He's an amazing wrestler. And as a grappler, I love to see what he's able to do. It's not my favorite style of MMA, and I'm with Ronda Rousey when she says maybe it's not that good for the sport. Ronda's a finisher too.
see more of Dave on www.ringsidereport.net. You can see, or hear rather, all the podcasts from the episodes Wednesdays and Fridays here on TSN 690.